welcome. This panel, we hope to have a number of questions from you. I'll make a few introductory comments on the energy transition. We'll go down the line, let each one of my colleagues, they've all picked different areas they'd like to highlight. Take about 3 minutes each to go through, and then we'll start taking questions from the House or among each other. And we'll make it hopefully very entertaining for all of us. Let me share a few things about energy transitions to start with. I work with Shell, and I've done a lot of study in this. Energy transitions are not something new. If you go back over the last several centuries, we've had one about every century. So it's critical that we see from that. They generally do take a long time. So when oil was first discovered in Pennsylvania, bubbling up from a spring, people knew exactly what to do with it. They bottled it and sold it for medicine. I'm not sure for what disease, but the idea of using it for energy was not on their mind. It took a century later before it was used greatly. From the time coal was demonstrated as a great source, except for the environmental impact, to generate electricity, it took a century before it took over 50%. So the reality is energy transitions take a long time. At Shell, we do a lot of scenario planning, and what we can say is by the end of this century, roughly 80 years from now, we'll be on a new energy system than we are today. All of our scenarios say that. The problem is if it takes till the end of the century, we're going to have more global warming than we would want. We've got to get there somewhere around mid-century. Some would say 2050, some would say 2770. Of course, the details do matter, but somewhere in that range to get to that point. So it's not critical that we just make a transition, but we make it soon enough. Now, the global, exactly how much the Earth has already warmed since industrialization, because we didn't have exactly the best measurements way back when it started, you could debate it, but about 0.7 degrees Celsius. So now the goals that came out of Paris were somewhere between 1.5 and 2.0. So the simple arithmetic says it's going to double even if we make our most optimistic goal. Now, how much of the current hurricanes we've had this year, typhoons, drought, forest fires are due to climate change? Get 12 climate scientists in the room and you'll have about 14 opinions is the answer. Yes, it's contributing. How much, we don't know for sure. It doesn't mean things are going to be twice as bad in the worst scenario, but it's probably going to be more challenging. Does that frame things quite well? So from a Shell standpoint, we're absolutely confident an energy transition is going to occur by the end of the century. The next question is, what will it be to? And we don't know. We spend more time trying to understand that. I can give you a very good scenario for multiple things, but that's what our panel is going to be talking about a great today. So if you have more questions, we'll be glad to do that. And will we get there by the 2050, 2070 point? It's going to be very challenging, because the reality is we have to start moving in mass scale today to make that change happen. And so we don't know exactly what we're going to. It takes a big bet to make that happen. But the technology is improving all the time. It's very important to look back for one thing as I close. If you look at all these energy transitions occurring, it was not because a bunch of government leaders met in some city and declared it. It was because it was a better energy system and people adopted it. Now, it may be this time because of the environmental issue, a group of government leaders getting together in a city can declare it, it will happen. I wouldn't use that as my only lever. So what I believe we have to do is create a new energy system very fast that people want and will adopt much quicker. I think we can adopt it much quicker now, but we have to get on with that. And so I turn to my panel, who will add perspective on that. All your tremendous experience in research and development, you must have this one solved, right?
I'll give it a try. Thank you. Well, I think we've talked a lot about transformation today, so I'd like to maybe say a few words about what are the main factors which are driving transformation and what's happening, especially on the technology front. So there are really, I think, 4 factors. First one is the cost of renewables. If you look at the last 10 years, cost of renewables has gone down 5 to 10x, not 5 to 10%, 5 to 10x. And then there was always the question of, yes, that's great, but it's intermittent, but the cost of storage, in 2010 was $1,200 a kilowatt hour, now it is $150 a kilowatt hour. So if you were to think about it, and if the renewables cost went down by another 2x and the cost of storage went to $50 per kilowatt hour, the entire energy, transportation, industry, buildings, landscape changes. The economics make a lot of sense then. So that's one of the things that's going to drive transformation. The second one is started off with some legislation, but is now catching steam, is the introduction of electric vehicles. So you have 2%, maybe a little bit less than 2%, projected to go to about 25%. Clearly, that will have an impact on energy. The third one, which is my favorite and is talked about, but I like to present a little bit different perspective, and that is the whole umbrella of artificial intelligence, digitization. Where it is today understood, you can clearly have a huge impact on efficiencies. All right? I mean, you can, improve your home, you can have appliances which are, so the energy intensity per unit of GDP, if you like, is going to continuously go down. In fact, we know that in OECD countries, it's decoupled. So that's the third thing. And the fourth thing is clearly the climate change. It's happening. The public opinion is getting right behind it. So it's going to have an influence. It's going to drive things. Just a couple of things. I think on the artificial intelligence side, the world is going to move towards self-organization. While change may be driven by governments, but I think what our problem is not change, it's rate of change. And so the rate of change will involve people engagement, and it is going to happen through self-organization. People may generate their own electricity. They will, harvest water. They will be using their electric vehicles to charge their houses, et cetera, et cetera. You know all about that. And I would like to say, and there are companies which are coming out there to promote this self-organization. There's a company in India, it's a new startup called Avant-Garde, which claims that for the price of an iPhone, you can buy a small wind turbine from them, which will charge your house for the entire lifetime. For the entire lifetime. And they're actually selling this at $750 for 1 kilowatt hour power. So they'll probably go bust, but these things are coming along. And so I think we will see a lot of these changes coming into fore. And then there is finally, I'd like to make a point, and that is that the artificial intelligence, as we today talk about it, is old in Silicon Valley. It's actually old. It's because the new area that is coming on in artificial intelligence is called deep learning. And the deep learning algorithms are aimed at doing things which humans, where the data cannot be interpreted by humans. And maybe later in the panel I can give a few examples, because I think when we talk about that kind of power, it really sets the things up around self-organization, about dramatic shifts going forward, and we need to get behind it in order to make it happen.
Bill?
Yeah.
Maybe I could have one of those mics.
Yeah. The transition certainly is taking place. Bill gave an excellent introduction, Chad. I think what I'd like to emphasize, without being too pessimistic, is the enormity of the change that has to happen on an accelerated basis in a world that is going to grow to 9 billion people, and those people are going to want the kind of lifestyle that everyone in this room has. So we cannot underestimate the magnitude of the change that has to take place. What does that mean? It means that all of these positive developments notwithstanding, we still have not broken the link between fossil fuels and economic growth. So we're still at the point where our fossil fuel use is growing as economic growth continues. So I come at this, and perhaps my contribution and passion here will be, we need not only an effective supply solution of renewables, we need mitigation strategies in the interim. And what do I mean by that? I would term mitigation as an insurance policy. What we want to do, all of us, and in 100 different ways, is adopt mitigation strategies which are going to in fact be the bridge to 10, 20, 30 years from now when we break that link between fossil fuels and growth. And I'll give you a couple examples. But in my worldview, mitigation strategies are not one magic bullet, but there are 100 different magic bullets. There are 100 different ways that we all can think about mitigating the effects of rapid climate change. You know, I read a little blurb in the paper the other day, all the huge headlines, but a little blurb. China has some advantages that maybe the rest of the world doesn't have. They have a lot of challenges, but they made a seemingly simple change. They directed all their provincial and state governments to adopt effective wildfire control strategies, and they made that performance metric a part of the evaluation strategies for those provincial governments. Wildfires down 40% in the last year in China. That's an effective mitigation strategy. Doesn't change supply, it doesn't change all these hopes that we have, but it certainly has contributed to, in a tiny way, to progress on controlling climate change. A couple of other, or one other mitigation strategy would be, and I think this is one that's particularly non-controversial, and one that we can all get behind, and that's plant a tree. So reforestation and afforestation efforts are, I think, relatively easy to understand. They're relatively easy to adopt. They're relatively easy to create partnerships around the world. So increasing our tree planting can be a relatively low-cost mitigation strategy as we bridge to this future of renewable energy. On the supply side, my own efforts have recently become involved with small-scale solar, off-grid solar in Africa. We have 1 billion people in Africa that are still using kerosene for lighting. That's a major climate change, significant climate change contributor, climate problems contributor. Just transitioning from kerosene to small off-grid solar would be a help, so I'm involved in that effort. I also fly the flag for what can be a controversial element, and that is smaller scale, replicable, relatively lower cost nuclear. So to think we're going to solve this problem without nuclear, I think is wrong-headed. Many people would disagree, but I think if we can all put our heads together, come up with a safe alternative, economic alternative to the present generation of nuclear plants, that would be a net positive. With that, I'll turn it over to Bob.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to just outline some of the activities that we're involved in as Smart Grid Ireland. Smart Grid Ireland was formed in 2009 for the purpose, and we're really a group of companies and individuals and engineers on the ground doing the actual work based on direction. The direction, then there's the execution, and then there's the results. And as you know, this was all driven by the Paris Agreement, as Chad pointed out earlier. The long-term goal, this is the direction, was to increase or to keep the increase in global average temperatures to below 2% or 2 degrees centigrade of low carbon. That's the low carbon agenda. The EU package currently takes us up to 2030 in terms of targets, working to those. Certainly the UK National Energy Strategy is working against 2030, as is the European. However, just recently, under the previous Prime Minister in England, Theresa May, she set into legislation for 2050 that would be net carbon by 2050. The question this brings to mind, of course, is, does this mean the end of fossil fuels? And something we have to look at. So the direction has been set in legislation by government that by 2050 we're shooting for a net carbon. All right? The vision then, of course, is to create a globally competitive economy that works for everyone. A globally competitive economy that works for everyone. That's the vision. In terms of execution, the measures that they've put in place, and I put them down here because there were so many of them, but essentially the 2050 target in legislation includes energy, agriculture, transport, consumer, behaviour and afforestation. There are 6 periods of 5 years within mid-term reviews. That's 12 checkpoints throughout the next from 2020 to 2050. Those climate action plans will be measured by government, local government, and certainly under the Irish climate action plan, each minister of each department is responsible now for measuring the execution of those targets. So what do we need to consider? In terms of on the ground where we work, we're looking at joining up the system from source of energy to the consumer. That's the challenge. The second one is breaking down the silos between energy sectors. And the third one is joining up the physical requirements of the system with policy, the market, and digital arrangements. Those are the things that, to summarise then, essentially, the big picture is we have a rapidly changing environment in energy affecting consumers, technology, policy and regulation, and utilities moving to become from retailers to actually service providers. So that's it. So the world is changing. And by 2030, Europe will produce 40% less CO2 emissions than in 1990. Europe will have 27% more renewable energy from what we had in 1990, and there'll be less primary energy usage versus business as usual. So those are the type of statistics floating around and the targets set out against this, the energy climate action plan from the European Union. Now this is having a major effect on the ground in terms of implementation. I talked about direction, execution and results. And someone talked earlier about transformation. That's the direction, then there's execution, then the results. So working with the Energyville people in Brussels, with Professor Ronnie Bellmans of Energyville, he's also head of the regulatory authority in Flanders. Work closely with him, and we identified 10, if you like, 10 changes or 10 megatrends within the whole energy system. The first one was prosumers in the built environment. Prosumers is a new word, of course, for people who produce electricity and also use electricity. And we have examples of that today in solar. So you'll be producing electricity and you'll be consuming electricity. And at the moment, some people are selling their electricity back onto the grid. That's the first. Certainly the second one is more electrification. We saw that in the presentation at the start, where buses, trams, various aspects of life will be electrified. The third one is disruptive storage technologies. Now, that's a major one because there's a big push today on batteries, and we're all for it. It's probably the best solution we have in terms of grid support. I have my serious concerns about it longer term in terms of what do you do with waste batteries later on. But at the moment, batteries is the main source of storage. There's flywheel storage, there is cave, carbon capture and salt mines and so on. But the main one at the moment we're dealing with is storage, is batteries. And we're looking at, of course, very much at other alternative methods of storage. There's DC, of course, there's always the argument between DC and AC. DC in both nano and nano microgrids as well coming up. There's direct current as well as alternative current. There's the Internet of Power, and we talked about that briefly in terms of the Internet of Things, the Internet of Power directly. There's going to be more flexibility and more intermittency. The wind doesn't always blow, and we live in an island where we have a natural resource called wind, and it doesn't always blow, but when it blows, the turbines work. When they stop working, the wind stops blowing, the turbines stop working. So we have intermittency, we have to deal with that in terms of the grid. You're trying to keep balance on the grid. There's a balance of supply, there's a balance on the grid. Because you have a 50 cycle, and I'm talking engineering here, a 50 cycle hertz on your grid, and if you move it 1% either way, you lose your power. And we had an example of that recently in London, where they lost power overnight. Now, people have to remember, and I think we forget sometimes, that we walk in here today, and we take for granted the lights are on. Switch the light off, the computer stops, everything stops. So fundamental in any economy is energy. It's a fundamental right, it's a fundamental need. Otherwise, if you look at the countries that are underdeveloped, and I keep saying to people, energy and infrastructure will drive your economy forward. So, then there's the competitiveness of renewable energy. We have different costs in terms of affordability, whether it's solar or wind or other sources. Thermal heat for future comfort. And by the way, I should say the ultimate goal here in all this is comfort. And all these changes taking place is comfort. And if you look at a large energy user, the needs are quite different from a small energy user. And I can talk to that in more detail later. Then there's the interwoven energy vectors. We have hydrogen. We're working at the moment on buses, at the moment in Belfast, on fuel cell. We also have electric buses. We're looking at both. I'm not sure yet about the carbon capture and hydrogen, but these are things we're going through in terms of what's the best solution long term. Looks like electric will probably be the way forward in the buses. So as I mentioned, there's large energy users, there's small energy users, and they both require different sources of energy. So there's the challenge that's set out in terms of people who are actually doing it. That brings, of course, the impact. What is the impact? The impact, of course, is there's new actors emerging with smart applications. There's growth in ancillary services beyond the grid. There's new commercial models. There's a whole transition in the energy market. And at the local level, for example, we had 3 power stations where I live. Today, we have 23,000. That's the difference. 23,000 turbines, all driving renewable energy, as opposed to 3 fossil fuel stations, which were there from 1990. This year, we have reduced 44% of our energy needs through wind. There's new technology, it's changing. Our relationship with energy, with consumers, with infrastructure providers, and with generators. So implementation, then, we come to the implementation. We have to define our focus areas going forward, domestic heat and transport, increased storage, especially commercial and industrial use. We need price stability. Again, it's an issue for us, price up and down. What's happening in Saudi Arabia just recently is affecting our prices. We need price stability. One of the things we're looking at is aggregation, where we take a cluster of companies and we provide aggregated renewable energy to them at certain times of the day, take peak power, and those are some solutions we're dealing with. So sector coupling is one we're looking at as well. How do you bring the integration of heat, energy and transport together? So those are the technical issues that are addressed, have to be addressed as we face this challenging future and meet the targets outlined by the government.
Rahman?
Thank you very much for good questions. And let me say about Kazakhstan, since you gentlemen covered already international practice. Kazakhstan is going through energy transformation for the past several years. Why? Because, well, as you probably well know, we're oil and gas and mining country, and the bulk of our budget proceeds come from the taxes from these companies, energy and metallurgical companies. But at the same time, we try to develop renewable energy only starting from 2013, 6 years ago. And as of now, I have to say that we have already achieved some milestone successes. The share of renewable in Kazakhstan is already about 1.4% of total electricity production. We have appropriate legislation in place, law in support of renewable energy, concept of moving Kazakhstan into green economy approved by the president, where the milestones of 3% by 2020, 10% by 30, and 50% by 2050 are indicated. So that's our targets to which we are working and trying to achieve. And hopefully next year, by the end of next year, we will achieve our first milestone. Kazakhstan is a unique example because and unlike in many of your countries, 80% of our current electricity production comes from coal-based stations. Most of them are old. They were built during Soviet times, 60s, 70s, 80s, last century. They are phasing out, they're ineffective, they're very energy intensive, as well as the whole our industry. So definitely that cannot last for long, taking into account that Kazakhstan has set a high goal of reaching 50 most developed nations club by 2030. And I have also to say that Kazakhstan is going transformation in energy, also including and in using international best experiences and international companies. For example, one company represented at this panel, Shell, is already an active investor in renewable energy in Kazakhstan, not back home in UK, in Netherlands, in Europe, but also in Kazakhstan. As well as ENI from Italy, as well as the mining companies, they all turned their faces for the period of 3 years only, and now on our side. We're trying to develop their renewable energy facilities assets as well. Why they all do that? Because the main goal is to secure energy stability, sustainable development, and security of Kazakhstan for the long run. And that's not possible with using of new types of energy. Even though in Kazakhstan they're still more expensive than traditional energy. You cannot beat electricity coming from Kibastos Gres 1 in northeast of Kazakhstan with $2 per kilowatt hour. But we're reaching that because capex in Kazakhstan for new assets are going down as well. The first pilot project of 100 megawatt Burne solar power station in south of Kazakhstan was constructed turnkey for approximately $210 million US. Last week there was a new coming online, the same size, 100 megawatt new solar station constructed by Kazakh and Chinese partners in Kapchagai near Almaty. Turnkey costs capexes were only $70 million. So in Kazakhstan that's happening as well. That helps us a lot to convince more people, more stakeholders why this is applicable to Kazakhstan as well, not only to developed world. And also important part of this transformation should come and should go on personal level of our 18 million people population, because it's up to their families, it's up to their mentality to be clean and green, to be ecologically friendly, and that's a big work which needs to be done. As I said, we already have constructed big stations all over the Kazakhstan, all types of them, but this year and next year we're starting to address our attention to small-scale generation by households, to small grids. Also important topic to local content, even though not so many international financial institutions and international energy companies like this. Because yes, we can have in the near future so many shiny solar stations all across Kazakhstan, powerful turbines stations, hydro stations, but there will be very limited percentage of goods, services, and works made in Kazakhstan. And that's the escape which we would like to escape. That's the situation, because unfortunately it's happening in oil and gas and mining industry of Kazakhstan. Renewable energy in Kazakhstan is on the level of startup of 1%, so why not do it Western way? Why not try to do it international best practice way? And that's very hard topic for us, but we are very optimistic. And international trends helps us again a lot, because Kazakhstan is an integral part now of the world society, world economy, on the energy traditional level, as well as a new alternative for renewable energy scene as well.
Thank you very much. Now we get to the question and answer period. I want to start by asking the audience a couple questions. So that means you listen up now. This is really important questions. So if a new electricity provider moved into your market, wherever that is in the world, and they offered 100% renewable energy from solar or wind source at the same price as your current supplier, how many would convert over? Okay, so give me an estimate of the crowd. What percent said they convert over? 70%. Okay, so Shell has done this in the UK. We bought a utility company. It's been operating for about 8 months now, branded as a 100% renewable supplier, and the market share is about 5%. So if what we see is, we can increase it, it's too early to tell. This will be a good test. Now, it's not a really good profitable proposition just yet. Looking at is, could we do it a different way where you'd have to opt out? So rather than opting in, you'd have to opt out. Right now, let me say it's well less than 50% of the people that are opting in. So this group is not typical, but and that's in a country that cares greatly about climate change and the issue. But it's early. So we think it's very important, if we're going to move at the pace we have to move, to run some experiments right now. And then the third thing, before I turn to your questions, Bill mentioned a billion people without electricity. And that's something we focused on a lot. And we decided we've got to take a major step forward, because if we leave those billion people behind, of the 7.5 billion people here, this equation is not going to work. So we decided for ourselves, we're going to bring electricity to 100 million of those people, or 10% of the billion. And it won't necessarily be all renewable. We'll bring them electricity in its best form we can, and we'll do that by 2030. It's a goal that when we were debating, we could see how to get to 1 million, and then we finally talked ourselves up to 10 million, and we said, well, let's go ahead and do it right. So the way we've done that is we found the 3 most successful companies that we could find that are doing it today, and we bought a big stake in them to understand them and see which one of these models ought to scale up. But we're taking this very seriously. It's not a social program. We got to make money at it, or we just can't afford to do it. So what I would leave you with those 3 points is, we've got to act right now, not just talk about it, not just give a few little examples. We have to move if we're going to avert the worst impacts of climate change. The floor is yours for questions. Who's first?
I would like to ask Jan Madek from Prague, Czech Republic. I would ask honorable panel why there is so big shortage of the calculation of those energy supplies if panel itself is full of engineers. And if we are talking about fossil-free electricity production in European Union, or at least some countries in 2050, we should calculate very precisely how the electricity will be produced. Because if you decide to build nuclear power station, you are deciding basically that you will need 10 years, 7-10 years to get permission, another 7-10 years to build it, and then you are producing another 60 years. So you are planning for 80 years forward. And now we are supposed to be fossil-free, 2050, pioneers. In Paris there was promised 2100, and even this is not far away for nuclear. And we don't know how we will produce it. And there are multiple targets. Nobody is saying that we should solve, first of all, the problem that current electricity for current use is, must be replaced by another sources, renewable sources. Plus, we should replace supply of oil and gas, because now we will use electric vehicles, electric buses, and so forth, what means another growth of electricity consumption. So calculations somehow are not done. There is a lot of ideology, but very little calculation how we will get there, how it is possible.
So who would like to respond?
Oh, wait, okay. I know where you're coming from. Oops.
It's not going to be easy. Using traditional nuclear, I know you're thinking on nuclear. I got that message, I think, yesterday. I don't think there'll be a lot of support for nuclear. So we'll have to find better ways, more efficient turbines, more efficient solar, more efficient renewable sources to actually meet the targets. And I think it's going to be really difficult from an engineering perspective, which I come from, to actually meet those targets. But at least we've got a direction. It's up to us to execute best we can. Engineering will always tell you it's possible. I'm telling you, I think it's possible, but I don't know how. But I don't believe nuclear is the answer.
Next question. Bill.
I'd just like to ask the panel, they're thinking about microgrid networks that could be set up globally. So I'm under a certain number of megawatts, so maybe under 50 megawatts, or maybe it's 20, 30 megawatts, but setting up the network in a way that you combine the best resources of whatever the country has. It has a lot of sunshine, fine. If it has a lot of wind, natural gas is cheap, or it can combine, as a threesome. But I'd just like to get your thinking about the notion of having networks that could be community-based, it could be a little more, but closer to the point of use versus where we are today, and just your overall view about the economics and the potential growth of doing microgrids globally as a solution, as one of the major solutions towards solving energy problems as we move towards the middle century.
Yeah, let me kick it off and ask the panel to join. I mentioned this 100 million people we're trying to get to in developing countries. We see that as mostly microgrid. The companies we're going with today are microgrid. That looks like the practical way to get it done, but we have to prove that out. So other comments from the panel? Bobby, you got...
We haven't mentioned India. This, and we don't have the Indian representatives, I don't believe, in the audience. This, in some measure, is going to be the big developing countries that are going to need to continue to develop. And Africa's billion, India's 1.3 billion. So I would enthusiastically say if India, Brazil, China have to find a way not to build coal plants and to provide energy for those citizens who want and have to have it to develop their own lives. So yes, enthusiastically yes, microgrids in India, microgrids in Africa are one of our biggest hopes.
Just like to add to that, microgrids as Western Europe as well. We're actually working at the moment with a major municipality on with a renewable energy company. I thought Chad and I might get some business here, but a renewable energy company where they're actually putting the microgrid in and contracting up to 10 years of level energy prices with the municipality, and they're installing at the capital cost themselves to put a microgrid in and supply renewable energy to that area, that citizen. So there's a lot of opportunities here around the microgrid, as Chad mentioned. Okay.
Yeah. So I'd like to make a couple quick comments about both the questions. About a month ago, Florida Light and Power, which is a big utility, said that they are now going to put a 409 megawatt storage unit, which will be solar based, and they're going to shut down 2 gas plants. And so in terms of the change we are talking about, and this is Florida Light and Power. So I think why is it that all of these things may accelerate at a rapid pace is because of not so much about technology, because of volume. So we are seeing that the volume across the world through microgrids, through different types of solar, wind, etc., geothermal, is all going in the direction where the costs are going to dramatically decrease. And so we are going to see adoption at a remarkably faster pace. The second thing is that let's not forget, we always talk about utilities. Utilities may not be the only solution to power supply going forward. I think self-organization is going to become very profound. Human beings will, across the world, will start to produce their own energy, not necessarily 100% to start with. We have companies which are looking at, not only the residential PV, where the cost, 20 years ago it was $8 per watt, now it is 25 cents per watt. But I think you're looking at a lot of thin film technologies which are coming up, 6 amorphous silicon, which are all now beginning to show 30% range efficiency. So human beings across the world, self-organization will become a much larger role, play a much larger role, and so will community-based microgrids.
Yeah, if I could just add one piece on India. The Energy Transition Commission, which I'm a part of, saw India as the most important country for us to convert properly. So all their growth would be done. So we did a major study and concluded that at least 70% of their growth, not their total use, could be solar, and you could balance the grid. We took that to the highest levels in India with a lot of thrust to sell it, and they're using coal, not our plant. So it's very easy to say what you should do until you're facing starving people and you got coal in the ground, and then it's really a tough call. So that's just reality. So we have to find ways to get through that. Next question.
Well, thank you very much. My question is, are we really moving toward the concept of the Internet of Electricity, where, not necessarily through wire, transferring the power, but even wireless? And is that concept is realizable? How far are we from it? Thank you.
So Qualcomm, which is a very major company, has a subset, which is a company called Halo, and their plan is to use 8 kilometers of entry to the cities or within the cities to charge your electric vehicle from 5-10% to full. So, it's wireless, it's induction. I think we are going to see a lot of these things in terms of, there's a company in Netherlands called HiET, which is for homes. And so you're going to have a lot of wireless things which are spawning right now from homes to electric vehicles, which will become real. And I think even companies like Tesla are looking at induction-based charging.
If I could just add, the issue is storage. Solar, wind will work, but you got to have storage. Right now, and there's a lot of work going on. We thought we'd have had this 10 years ago. It's not there. At Shell, we're following every piece of it. But if we can break that, we can make almost anything work if we can store this stuff. So what we're focusing on is traditional, battery storage of some kind. Lithium-ion is approaching what it can do, probably 30% better. And then we're going to need another metal system to do it. The other option is hydrogen. Hydrogen works. It works today. You got to be able to move it around. Shell, in partnership with the government of Japan, is building a ship to move hydrogen around, because with electrolysis, you could create your hydrogen and that be your storage mechanism. So that's a very feasible system, but then you've got to convert the system over to hydrogen. But these things we just got to move, if I stress fast on, we just can't keep studying for 10 years. So we got to run the experiments. But Bob?
Yeah, just to follow on from that. Hello? Yeah. One of the things that Schneider Electric are doing across Europe, they're actually buying solar in Spain for pittance, for very little money. They're buying wind in Denmark, and they contract with the suppliers of these renewable energy companies for X capacity. They transfer the electric, the renewable energy through the interconnectors across Europe, and they supply the energy to the large multinationals like pharmaceuticals, and on a 10 and 15-year contract on level pricing. So they're buying all over the world and through interconnectors and selling it to the large companies, and of course take a brokerage fee. So that's, and you talk about India, you know, there's an example again of a large landmass that needs energy, and if you can buy it across the world, depending how you're connected, and we live in a connected world, there's solutions.
One more question. Okay, two more questions. Go ahead.
Well, to arrive at the finish line, we have to run at speed from now. And the finish line could be 2050 and an interim 2030. The reality is that though the rate of increase of emissions is decreasing, in absolute terms, the emissions are still increasing. They are still increasing. So let's talk about incentives. And these incentives could be at corporate level, at national level. And that's the question I would like to raise. Can we introduce incentives in companies? Let's say in terms of executive pay, linking emission targets in energy companies to their long-term incentive plans. That's one point. And at the national level, what is being done at the moment at the European Union level, because the European Union is the most advanced in terms of committing to these targets. What is being done in terms of including and embracing these targets in terms of the new support package 2020-2025 from the European Union? Are we thinking about it?
Great point. Shell, we've already tied executive pay to not only our own emissions, but the emissions of our customers. And that's effective this year.
Just one factor which is not widely discussed is the end user impacts. If we look at industry, for example, and who in industry, who are major electricity consumers, who can modulate consumption in an intermittency type arrangement. So we have an aluminium industry expert. Aluminium is a classic case of where smelters could in fact be virtual batteries, and the Germans particularly are going into modulated power consumption of some of our largest energy uses in that thing. So how and what do we see in the way of industry developments into a much more dynamic kind of energy supply?
It's been a while since I was there, but you know, the biggest change in the aluminum industry is, of course, in mining, you have almost now 50 million kilometers of self-driving vehicles. And so you have some energy conservation based on per unit of output. You have using artificial intelligence to get early warning systems. So if we don't have large fluctuations in energy for which we have to arrange, but I don't think that we are using that, the energy package for other things as far as I know.
So let's go to Armand. Could you start off, and every panel member, one last charge to the audience based on the subject we're talking about? Just a couple sentences. What would you suggest?
If it would be a couple sentences, then we are working hard to make it happen in Kazakhstan for energy transition.
Great. Bob?
I really wanted to address your question on an example of incentives. I can think of one particular health service in Belfast where they've got 200 million to spend in capital investment, but before finance will approve it, they must show a significant carbon reduction in the replacement of that. So that is incentive.
Let me just echo Chad's urgency. Unfortunately, I think the chances that we will experience greater warming than the scientists predict are greater than the reverse. There is talk now that the goals of 2050 might have to be advanced to 2040. That's just going to create additional urgency to do all the things that this panel has talked about.
Global energy is industry, whether it is the energy industry or automotive industry or chemical industry, you name it, it's in the 35% energy efficient. And I think artificial intelligence combined with the deep learning capabilities will identify what I would call the unknown waste, and that will have a dramatic shift.
So I think if we wait for governments to lead the way, we're going to wait a long time. I think businesses and universities can come together right now, form consortiums, find those really key leverage points to advance the technology quickly and move on with it, and we should just do that. And maybe we could do some of those as a result of this session today. Thank you very much.